Suspension, suspension, suspension. One of the most complex and sometimes controversial aspects of RC. Let's just get started and see where this goes. What's up guys, welcome back to FullThrottleRC. I made a post here and on Instagram asking what you wanted to see me cover in a video since I was stuck inside because of the tropical storm we're dealing with right now. If you hear any odd noises in the background, I'm not in the middle of a war zone or anything, it's just some wind and rain. It seemed like the most popular topic you wanted to see is the intricacies of suspension and how it's used in RC drag racing. I hesitated to make this video because there are a bunch of different opinions on suspension out there that depend on the car you run, the surface you run on, and way too many other variables for me to list. So know that everything I'm about to tell you in this video is strictly my opinion and what I run on my cars based on my experience and my equipment. So where do I start with this? You know, in something like a monster truck, it's kind of easy. You want a big shock with a lot of travel and probably a medium rate spring. Something to soak up the big hits when landing a jump. Not too soft that it slams down too quickly, but not so stiff that the truck bounces all around when it lands. In a typical on-road car, the shocks are a lot shorter. Their job is to soak up the imperfections in the road, or in the case of racing, control body roll and help with cornering. But I don't have much knowledge on that, so let's move on. A drag car doesn't jump. Or it shouldn't anyway. And the whole point of it is to go in a straight line, so you shouldn't need to worry about making turns. So where exactly does suspension come into play in drag racing? If you look at most of the factory-built or purpose-built drag cars, you won't see any shocks. These cars are designed to run on scale drag strips that are pretty close to a perfect surface, so they don't need much of a suspension. But the point of a no-prep car is to be able to run on any surface, so we need some suspension to handle a rough road. Pretty much everyone agrees on a stiff front suspension, and when you think about it, it's pretty obvious why. If the front suspension was soft on a drag car, when you hit a bump in the road, the suspension would soak it up, but could also continue to bounce up and down. Without getting too deep into it, this would make the car hard to control and would ultimately slow you down. Another thing a lot of people do up front is add a limiter. Something like a short section of fuel tubing like I have here prevents the nose of the car from diving down and rubbing the body on the ground when braking. I run a high viscosity oil in the front shocks, which helps set the front end down nice and slowly on launch. The last thing that's really important in the front is making sure both sides are symmetrical. I like to lift up the front from the center and make sure both arms travel down at the same rate and bottom out at the same time. The rear is where it gets a little more complicated. Before we start talking about shocks, the most important thing is a sway bar. If you aren't running a sway bar, none of this will matter. We can't have the car squatting to one side or the other. For those of you that don't know, squat is how the car reacts when throttle is applied. The weight transfer to the rear of the car and the suspension compression at that point is called squat. This is where I kinda differ from most people you talk to. A lot of people like to run a stiff rear suspension as well. I've seen and heard of guys running diff fluid in their rear shocks to get it as stiff as possible even. Now, before you head to the comments, I am in no way saying that is wrong. As the saying goes, if it works, it ain't stupid. But personally, I like to run my suspension a little on the softer side. The first thing you notice is this shock tower extension. I've explained this before, but basically, with the shocks mounted in the original location, they work progressively. They're at an angle, meaning as the suspension compresses, the rate at which it compresses changes. I don't want that. This tower extension allows the shocks to be mounted perpendicular to the ground, which lets them work directly, meaning the rate of compression is the same throughout the entire movement. This is one way I keep my suspension relatively soft. I run 50 weight oil in my rear shocks, which lets them react quickly. I've tried 3 different spring rates before I settled on this setup, and this is where I actually combat the softness a little. I run a medium rate spring in the rear, specifically the orange team associated springs. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but basically the stiffer spring keeps the suspension from bottoming out too quickly and staying there, from what I can tell. So why do I like a soft rear suspension? It's all about weight distribution. Traction is what we're all searching for in no prep racing, and one of the ways to get it is to get weight on the rear of the car. We can't just pile weight back there though, because the car will never set the front end down and you won't be able to control it. The soft suspension allows weight to shift to the back of the car when it squats on launch to gain that traction, and as it goes down track, the weight can shift back forward and keep the front end down. That's the easiest way I could think to explain it to you without boring you with all the physics. Preload in the rear can help straighten out an unbalanced car. You can see my shock preload is pretty even on both sides, but if the car is leaving in a direction other than straight, I can add or remove preload to combat it. Truthfully, this always confuses me a bit, but after some thought, it's relatively easy to work out. Let's say the car always launches to the left. Assuming everything else is balanced, my servo is centered, and my wheel hub isn't stripped, I can add preload to the right-hand side by cranking down on the adjustment ring, making the right side stiffer. Now when the weight shifts to the rear, the left side is softer, allowing it to gain better traction than the right and should straighten the car up. It's a lot of trial and error to dial it in, but the best way to see it in action is just to try it. It's a whole lot easier to understand when doing it yourself. Now, one thing people overlook when tuning suspension is the wheelie bar. The wheelie bar is actually part of the suspension. You can have your shocks tuned perfectly, but if the wheelie bar isn't set right, you're not going anywhere fast. First and foremost, it prevents the car from flipping over when you actually have traction. That would not be good. Secondly, it can actually steer the car for the first few feet on a good launch. Most wheelie bars I see on these cars have two wheels, and both wheels need to be the same height, or when the car launches and hits the wheelie bar, it will steer it one way or the other. This can also be used to steer the car just like preload. Using the example of launching to the left again, if I adjust the wheelie bar where the right wheel is lower than the left side will squat further down, allowing it to gain more traction and drive the car straight. Now that the wheelie bar is level or set so that the car goes straight, how high do I set it? Well, this is something that is once again a lot of trial and error, but once you find the sweet spot, you shouldn't need to move it much. You don't want it too high because as cool as wheelies look, they can kill speed if the front end is still up in the air, way down track. Not to mention you can't steer with the front wheels in the air. You also don't want it too low because if the car can't squat down properly, it'll just hit the wheelie bar and unload the tires, meaning the rear tires can actually come off of the ground and you don't have any traction. A good starting point is to compress the rear suspension to around how much you think it does on a launch, and then set the wheelie bar where it's just barely touching the ground or a little higher. You can set a piece of paper or cardboard under the wheels while you tighten it down. Then go out, test, and adjust as needed. Man, this ended up being a lengthy video, but I knew what I was getting into talking about suspension. Once again, like I said, these are just my opinions based on what I run and my experiences with my car. There are a lot of other factors that go into what works and what doesn't, and I'm sure you could watch other videos and ask other people and get a bunch of different suggestions. I'm happy with the performance this setup has given me after trying a bunch of different things, and I think it'll stay like this. Even though it was quite a task to go into this topic, I want to thank everyone who suggested I cover this. It helped me pass the time as we ride out this storm. I enjoy doing these videos covering the things you want to know that can help you out in the hobby. So let me know in the comments below what else you want to see here on the channel. Like I said, it doesn't have to be just drag racing. Any information or details you want to know about any other RC I have, I'm an open book. Let me know. For those of you still watching after all of that rambling, I wish I could give you a like instead of asking you to leave a like on this video. But that's about all for today. As always, thanks again for watching. Peace.